Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on experimental research designs. We would spend some time to look at what an experimental research design in terms of the components and in terms of how to operationalize it. That's how do you carry out an experimental research design. We'll also look at a couple of different types of experimental research design. And so, just to provide an overview of experimental research design, experimental research designs are the traditional type of research designs. Traditional in the sense that those are the ones that are very basic, are very common, especially in the natural sciences, and also in some social science disciplines, and they involve some type of manipulation. The purpose of experimental research design is to investigate cause and effect relationship among variables. That is to determine um, what the cost of something is and what's the outcome of something. So, for instance, if we were looking at employee turnover, we could look at it from the perspective of how does, let's say, um, the supervisor's attitudes and behaviors um, towards the subordinates or workers in a organization um, results in employee turnover. Um, there is an experimental design that we'll look at shortly that talks about um, having groups. In most experimental designs, you would have groups, usually two or more groups. There is what we call the treatment group, and then what we call the experimental group. The treatment group is also called the control group. The experimental group is the group that does not have any type of intervention. But the experimental group is the one that has the intervention, um, and the control group is the one that does not have the intervention. The control group is also called the treatment group. Let's say, hypothetically, there's a new drug that is manufactured to um, test it to treat diabetes. Um, in order to determine the efficacy of that new drug, we could have two groups of people that we could recruit to participate in a study to test efficacy. And the first group will be the experimental group, which would receive treatment with this new drug, whereas the control group will receive what we call a placebo, or an intervention that is not the drug, or a, an intervention that may look like a sugar pill. In some instances, they may not receive anything. And so, um, in experimental research design, each group of participants receives a different type of treatment. And there is always some type of manipulation, either in the assignment of the people to the groups or either in the manipulation of the treatment, uh, which is that one group may receive an treatment and the other one may not. And experimental research design answers the fundamental question of what will be. So, if a group of people were to receive this and the other were not to receive, what will be the outcome? And with experimental research design, it is more than any type of research experiment. It follows an orderly sequence or procedure. There are specific steps that are involved when we conduct experimental research studies. Um, and so the first step that we need to undertake in experimental research design is to state the research problem. What is that gap in knowledge that we want to address? What is that thing that we've identified either from the literature or from our observations um, or from previous experiences that we are yet to know fully and that we want to know? And then the next thing is to determine if experimental methods would apply. In the previous example that I gave about supervisory leadership and employees turnover behavior, is that a study that you think that an experimental method would apply? And if you were to do that, um, how would you carry that out? What are some ways that you would design it such that you are able to give one group some type of intervention and not give the other group another intervention? Um, the next important thing that we need to pay attention to when we're doing experimental design is to delineate the variables. That's to um, highlight or um, clearly describe what the independent and dependent variables are. In one of the previous slides, I talked about the dependent variable as the outcome variable and the independent variable as the influencer. One is the influence and the one that is manipulated, and the other one is the outcome. So in the case of the example that I gave, the independent variable would be the supervisor's behaviors or attitudes towards subordinates, and the dependent variable is the turnover behavior. Um, Once we've identified the independent and dependent variables, then we have to state the hypothesis, which is a speculation or tentative guess of the relationship that may exist between the variables. Um, the hypothesis that we would state would also reflect what our research questions are. The research questions are the basic or fundamental questions that we're trying to answer in our research studies. Next thing we need to do is to determine what measures we would use um, in terms of the instruments that we would use in our study to measure the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. We may have to pause to consider the potential success. What are the factors that are likely to contribute to our success, and what are some variables or factors that are intervening that may impact the relationship between the two variables? Um, Afterwards, we will design the experiment and then conduct the experiment as planned, um, and then analyze the data that we get from the experiment and write out a report. So an experimental research design is quite extensive. The next thing that we'll look at is research validity, which is related to the findings or the results that we have from experimental design. In an experimental research study, we have to also um, put into consideration the findings that we would have. Um, there are two important um, types of validity that we have to consider when we're doing experimental research studies. The first one is internal validity, which is the soundness it pertains to the soundness of the study itself. We're concerned uh, about the results, the extent to which we're certain that we have control of the extraneous influences that might affect the outcome. So that means we're certain that the relationships that we've determined cannot be ascribed onto a, a third variable or some other factor, but strictly um, uh, strictly reflect what the actual relationships are between the variables that we're looking at. The second thing is external validity, which is the extent to which we can um, generalize these findings to populations other than the ones that we looked at. So if we do a study, let's say among students, in terms of a particular professor's teaching strategies and students' learning outcome or success, and that study was done at Alabama A&M. Um, External validity will require that we also make generalizations about our findings to uh, other populations. That is to say, if we did the same study at a different university, would we have the same outcomes, or would we have similar outcomes or different outcomes? And so both external and internal validity, they're important for conducting a study and in planning and especially designing our study. Um, Internal validity is considered to be the basic minimum for experimental research. And the reason is because we want to make sure that whatever relationships that we're trying to establish or determine are true for those two or several variables that we're looking at and cannot be ascribed to any other variable outside influences or factors. So the next thing that we're going to look at is the threats to internal validity. There are several threats to internal validity, and this uh, include history, maturation, testing, and instrumentation. History meaning events that may have occurred within the time that the study was done that uh, are likely to um, be ascribed to the outcomes. They are not part of the treatment, but also occurred. So let's say a study was done with a group of people, and we were trying to find out the impact of a certain drug on them. But within that same period, something may have happened that um, may have also impacted their lives in a positive way. We could say that that event happening is a likely likely threat or threats to our interpretation of the results. Another one is maturation, which is a change in the state of the individual due to the change in passage of time. So maybe you did a study with a group of people, um, let's say young people, probably around the age of 14, 15. And as time goes on, maybe it's a longitudinal study. And so you notice that their maturity and their experiences may have changed over time. That's a likely threat to the internal validity of the study. The other next one is testing. Um, Testing in the sense that whatever instrument or test that we conduct upon um, a person, if we were to do a repeated test, same test on a person, it is likely uh, that that person may have changed due to their exposure or their experience with that test. Let's say I give you a test today, a quiz to complete, and you completed that quiz. If I was to give you the same quiz tomorrow, your score on that quiz will likely change because you were exposed to that test. You may become more familiar with it, and so may be able to get the answers more correctly. Similar to that,